Where are they?
I don't know, please!
You have one more chance.
The desert wind carried whispers of death across the broken town of Crimson Ridge, where shadows fell long and justice came short. Dust devils spun between the weathered buildings like ghosts seeking vengeance, and the sun hung merciless in a sky the color of old blood. It was the kind of place where secrets festered like untreated wounds, where fear bred faster than rattlesnakes, and where a woman's knowledge could be mistaken for something far more dangerous. Colt Steele rode his black stallion through the heat shimmer, his hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much. The leather of his gun belt was worn smooth from years of quick draws, and the twin Colts at his hips rested easy as breathing. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had danced with death and lived to tell about it, though he rarely told anyone anything. The town ahead looked like every other godforsaken outpost he'd passed through, but something in the air felt different. Wrong. The kind of wrong that made his trigger finger itch. As he crested the last ridge before town, the sound reached him, shouting, angry voices rising like steam from hell itself, and beneath it all something else. Something that made his jaw clench and his horse's ears prick forward, the crackle of flames. In the town square, a crowd had gathered like vultures around carrion, men with their sleeves rolled up, women clutching their children close. All of them focused on the wooden stake that had been driven deep into the packed earth at the center of it all. And tied to that stake, her long auburn hair catching the light of the kindling piled around her feet, was the most beautiful woman Colt had ever seen. She wasn't screaming. That was the first thing that struck him. Her green eyes, bright as bottled glass, swept over the crowd with something that looked less like fear and more like pity. Her dress, once white but now stained with dust and blood, clung to a frame that spoke of strength beneath softness. Even with her hands bound behind her and death licking at her ankles, she held her head high, which someone in the crowd shouted, "She poisoned my cattle with her devil herbs, cursed my well dry," another voice added, "killed my boy with her dark magic." The woman's voice, when it finally came, was clear and steady as mountain stream water. "I healed your cattle with willow bark and honey. I showed you where to dig for fresh water, and your boy died of fever because you wouldn't let me treat him until it was too late." Her words only fed the flames of their anger. A man in a preacher's collar stepped forward, a torch in his hand and madness in his eyes. "The devil speaks through her even now. Let God's fire cleanse this evil from our midst." Colt's hand moved to his gun before his mind caught up. He'd seen lynchings before, had even participated in a few when justice demanded it. But this felt different. This felt like watching innocence burn for the crime of being misunderstood. The preacher lowered the torch toward the kindling. The woman closed her eyes, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been a curse. The crowd held its breath. The first shot took the torch from the preacher's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt where it hissed and died. The second shot cut the rope, binding the woman to the stake before anyone could even turn to see where the bullets had come from. Colt urged his horse forward through the scattering crowd, his guns drawn and gleaming in the sunlight. "Step away from the woman," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from knowing you were the most dangerous thing in a 50-me radius. "This ain't your business, stranger," the preacher snarled, clutching his burned hand to his chest. "I'm making it my business." Colt's eyes never left the crowd, but he could feel the woman's gaze on him like a physical touch. Anyone who wants to argue about it can take it up with Smith and Wesson here. He dismounted without holstering his weapons, moving like liquid shadow toward the stake. The woman had slumped against her bonds when the rope was cut, but she was still conscious, still watching him with those incredible green eyes. "Can you ride?" he asked her quietly. She nodded, though he could see the effort it cost her. He cut the ropes around her wrist with a knife that appeared in his hand like magic, then steadied her as she swayed on her feet. "This isn't over," the preacher called out. "We know what she is." Colt turned, his gun still drawn, his eyes like chips of winter ice. "Then you better hope you're wrong, because if I find out you were fixing to burn an innocent woman," he let the threat hang in the air like smoke. "Well, let's just say I've got a real problem with bullies." He helped the woman onto his horse, swinging up behind her before the crowd could organize itself for pursuit. Her body was warm against his chest, trembling like a bird that had just escaped a cat's claws. As they rode out of town, he could hear the angry voices growing fainter behind them, but he knew they wouldn't give up easily. Fear had a way of making cowards brave and stupid both. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour, climbing into the rocky foothills where the air grew cooler and the shadows offered shelter. When Colt finally pulled his horse to a stop beside a natural spring hidden among the red rocks, the woman practically fell from the saddle. He caught her before she hit the ground, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. "Easy," he murmured, carrying her to a patch of soft grass near the water. "You're safe now." She looked up at him with those green eyes, and for the first time since he'd seen her, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you help me?" Colt found himself at a loss for words. He'd asked himself the same question during the ride, and the only answer that made sense was one he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Instead, he pulled off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ember," she said, her voice barely audible. "Ember Wilde." "Well, Miss Wilde, seems to me a man doesn't need a reason to keep innocence from burning." She laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Innocent? They called me a witch, said I consorted with the devil. Do you?" The question surprised her. She studied his face, looking for judgment or mockery, but finding neither. "I know things," she said finally, "about plants and healing. My grandmother taught me before she died. But knowledge isn't evil, is it? Depends on what you do with it." Colt knelt beside the spring, filled his canteen, and brought it to her. "Drink. You need water." She obeyed, and he watched the way her throat worked as she swallowed, the way her hands shook as she held the metal container. There were rope burns on her wrists, bruises on her arms that spoke of rough handling. Someone had hurt her before they tried to kill her, and the sight of it made something dark and dangerous stir in his chest. "What about you?" she asked when she drunk her fill. "Do you have a name, or should I just call you Mysterious Savior?" Clane flickered in her eyes. "The gunfighter, I've heard stories, most of them are lies." "Are they?" She pulled his coat tighter around herself. "The stories say you're faster than lightning and twice as deadly, that you've never lost a gunfight." "I've never lost one I walked away from," he corrected. "There's a difference." Night was falling, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Colt built a small fire in a ring of stones, keeping it low so the smoke wouldn't give them away. Ember sat wrapped in his coat, watching him work with curious eyes. "They'll come after us," she said. "I know. They won't stop. Not until I'm dead. Then we'll have to make sure that doesn't happen." She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "My grandmother always said fire was both destroyer and creator, that it could burn away the old to make room for the new." She looked at him across the dancing light. "Do you believe that?" "I believe fire burns what you feed it," Colt said. "Question is, what are you planning to feed it?" Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, distant but coming closer. Colt was on his feet in an instant, kicking dirt over the fire and plunging them into darkness. "How many?" Ember whispered. He listened, his head tilted, counting the rhythm of the horses. 6, maybe 7. The whole posse looks like. He moved to where his horse was tethered, checking his weapons by feel. "Can you handle yourself in a fight?" "I'm not helpless. That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. "I won't slow you down." The hoofbeats were getting closer, and Colt could see torches flickering between the rocks below. They'd found the trail, and they were following it with a persistence of men who believed they were doing God's work. "There's a cave system about a 4 mile up the canyon," he said, leading his horse by the reins. "We can lose them in there if we move now." They climbed through the darkness, Ember's hand in his as he guided her over the treacherous ground. She moved with surprising grace for someone who'd spent the day tied to a stake, and he found himself respecting her strength as much as her beauty. The cave mouth was hidden behind a curtain of rock and shadow, invisible unless you knew where to look. Colt had discovered it years ago during another manhunt, another desperate flight from men who believed they knew right from wrong. It seemed fitting that he should return here now with another fugitive from frontier justice. "Wait here," he told her once they were safely inside. "I'm going back to muddy our trail." "Don't leave me," she said quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, I don't want to be alone," he understood. She'd been alone when they tied her to the stake. Alone when the flames were lit. Alone until a stranger rode out of nowhere to save her life. The darkness probably felt too much like death for comfort. "I'll be back," he promised. 5 minutes, no more. He was true to his word, returning with their pursuers' voices echoing off the canyon walls as they realized they'd lost the trail. Ember was sitting with her back against the cave wall, still wrapped in his coat, looking small and lost in the darkness. "They're moving on," he reported, settling down beside her. "But they'll be back at first light. What then? Then we'll be long gone." She turned toward him, though in the absolute darkness of the cave he could only sense her movement. "Why are you doing this, really?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Colt had asked himself the same thing a dozen times during their flight, and the answer that kept coming back scared him more than any gunfight he'd ever faced. "I knew a woman once," he said finally. "Long time ago. She had healing hands, too, gentle hands." His voice grew rough. Bunch of drunken cowboys didn't like the way she looked at them when they came into town. Said she was too proud for a breed, too uppity. Ember's intake of breath was sharp in the darkness. "They burned her cabin while she slept," he continued. "By the time anyone thought to help, there was nothing left but ashes and bones. I'm sorry. Her name was Morning Star. She was going to be my wife." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with old grief and older guilt. Colt had never told another living soul about Morning Star, had never spoken her name aloud since the day he'd buried what was left of her in the hills above the burned cabin. "Is that why you saved me?" Amber asked softly. "Because I reminded you of her?" "No," the word came out harsher than he'd intended. "Morning Star was dark where you're light, quiet where you speak your mind. You're nothing like her. Then why?" He reached out in the darkness, found her hand, felt the calluses on her fingers from years of grinding herbs and mixing medicines. "Because sometimes a man gets a chance to do the right thing twice." They sat in silence after that, listening to the distant sounds of the search party giving up for the night. Ember's hand was warm in his, and he found himself thinking about things he'd buried along with Morning Star hope. Trust, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could be something more than a gun for hire, drifting from town to town. When dawn came creeping through the cave mouth, painting the rocks in shades of rose and gold, they were still sitting together, their hands joined, their breathing synchronized. Colt woke first, surprised that he'd slept at all, more surprised that he dreamed of something other than gunfire and blood. Ember stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. For a moment they just looked at each other in the growing light, and something passed between them that was deeper than words, stronger than the fear that had brought them together. "We should go," she said finally. "Yeah, but neither of them moved." "Colt." "Yeah, thank you for everything." He squeezed her hand once, then let go and rose to check the mouth of the cave. The canyon was empty, the search party long gone, but he knew it was only temporary. Men like the preacher didn't give up easily, especially when they believed they were fighting the devil himself. "There's a town called Haven's Rest about 2 days' ride north," he said as they prepared to leave. "Good people there. They'd take you in, help you start over." Ember was quiet as she folded his coat and handed it back to him. "What about you?" "I've got business elsewhere, running from something." The question was too close to the truth for comfort. "Always am." They rode north through country that grew greener and more forgiving with each mile. The desert gave way to grassland, then to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and wild flowers. It was beautiful country, the kind of place where a person could put down roots and forget about the ugliness of the world. But peace was a luxury Colt had never been able to afford. And he found himself watching the horizon more than the scenery. Old habits died hard, and in his experience, trouble had a way of following him wherever he went. On the second day, they stopped at a creek to water the horse and rest in the shade of a massive cottonwood. Ember had been quiet most of the morning, lost in thoughts she wasn't ready to share. But as they sat beside the running water, she finally spoke. "Tell me about her," she said. "Morning Star." Colt was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, distant, like he was talking to himself as much as to her. She had eyes like midnight and a laugh that could make you forget every bad thing you'd ever done. Clear's throat grew up on a reservation until the soldiers came and scattered her people like leaves. After that, she drifted from town to town. Same as me, only she healed folks instead of killing them. How did you meet her? I got shot up in a range war down in Texas. Bad wound, infected. Everyone said I was going to die. He smiled at the memory. Morning Star had other ideas. Spent 3 weeks nursing me back to health. And somewhere in there, I fell harder than I'd ever fallen for anything in my life. But you never married, never got the chance. The pain in his voice was raw, unhealed, even after all these years. I was away when it happened, tracking down the men who'd hired me for the range war, making sure they paid their bill. Came back to find her cabin, nothing but charcoal and memories. Ember reached over and touched his hand. I'm sorry. I told myself I was too late because I was too far away. Snorts, but the truth is I was scared. Scared of settling down. Scared of being responsible for someone else's happiness. So I took that job when I should have stayed. He looked at her, his eyes haunted. I was a coward and she died because of it. You can't know that. I know I wasn't there when she needed me. They sat in silence, the creek babbling softly between them. Finally, Ember spoke again. My grandmother always said the past was like a broken bone. If you set it right and let it heal, it makes you stronger. But if you keep poking at it, it never stops hurting. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She's the one who taught me about plants and healing. Said knowledge was a gift from the Creator meant to be shared with those who needed it. Ember's voice grew bitter. The people in Crimson Ridge saw it differently. What happened to make them turn on you? Drought came last spring. Crops failing, cattle dying, wells going dry. People were scared, looking for someone to blame. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I tried to help, showed them which plants could heal their animals, where to dig for water, how to make medicines for the fever that was going around. For a while they were grateful. But when the preacher's son died, despite everything I did, gratitude turned to suspicion. They started saying my cures worked too well, that no one could know so much about healing without making a deal with dark forces. And the preacher believed them. The preacher lost his mind when his boy died. Started preaching that the drought was God's punishment for tolerating witchcraft in their midst, said I was the source of all their troubles. She was quiet for a moment. Maybe he was right. Maybe they were better off before I came along. You really believe that? I don't know what to believe anymore. Colt stood up, offering her his hand. I believe a woman who spends her life healing folks isn't the kind of evil the world needs to worry about. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. For a moment, they stood close enough that he could smell the wildflower scent in her hair, see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Something sparked between them, hot and sudden as lightning, and he found himself leaning toward her before common sense reasserted itself. We should keep moving, he said, stepping back. Yes, she agreed, but her voice was breathless, and he could see the pulse jumping in her throat. They reached Haven's Rest just as the sun was setting on their second day of travel. It was a small town, clean and peaceful with white-painted houses and well-tended gardens. The kind of place where children played in the streets and people left their doors unlocked at night. It's beautiful, Ember said as they rode down the main street. It's safe, Colt corrected. And that's what matters. He found rooms for them at the local boarding house, paying for a week in advance, despite Ember's protests that she had no money to pay him back. The proprietor, a motherly woman named Mrs. Henderson, took one look at Ember's travel-stained dress and rope-burned wrist and immediately bustled her off for a hot bath and a proper meal. Colt watched them go from the porch of the boarding house, a strange tightness in his chest. This was what he'd brought her here for, safety, a chance at a normal life. People who would judge her by her actions rather than their fears. So why did watching her disappear into someone else's care feel like losing something precious? He was still standing on the porch an hour later when she reappeared, transformed by soap and water and a borrowed dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair, clean and brushed, fell in waves over her shoulders, and she moved with a grace that spoke of inner strength rather than merely surviving. Mrs. Henderson says there's a doctor in town who needs an assistant, she said, joining him at the porch rail. Someone who knows about herbs and healing. That's good. Perfect, even. Yes. But she didn't sound happy about it. They stood together, watching the last light fade from the sky, the comfortable domesticity of the town settling around them like a blanket. Somewhere a dog barked and a mother called her children in for supper. It was peaceful, normal, everything Ember deserved and everything Colt had never allowed himself to want. "You're leaving in the morning," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, where will you go?" "Wherever the trail takes me." She nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "And if I asked you to stay?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd been asking himself the same thing for the past 2 days, and the answer scared him more than facing down a dozen armed men. "I can't, or won't." He turned to look at her, seeing the hurt she was trying to hide behind a brave facade. "Ember, I'm not the kind of man who settles down. I've got too much blood on my hands, too many enemies looking for me. Staying would only bring trouble to you and everyone else in this town. What if I don't care about the trouble? I do." She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "My grandmother once told me that some people are born to wander, that they carry the wind in their hearts and can never be still. But she also said that even the wind sometimes needs a place to rest." "Ember, I know." She smiled, sad and beautiful and brave. "I know you have to go. I just wanted you to know that if you ever get tired of running, this could be a place to rest." Before he could respond, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of everything he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Then she was gone, disappearing into the boarding house and leaving him alone on the porch with the taste of her on his lips and a hollow ache in his chest that felt suspiciously like grief. He left before dawn, slipping away while the town still slept, because goodbyes were harder than bullets, and he'd already taken more damage than he could afford. But as he rode away from Haven's Rest, he found himself looking back more often than was wise for a man with his reputation. For 3 weeks, Colt drifted aimlessly through the territory, taking whatever jobs came his way, and trying to forget the taste of Ember's kiss and the sound of her laughter. He told himself he'd done the right thing, that she was better off without him, that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the nights were the worst when sleep brought dreams of auburn hair and green eyes, of gentle hands that could heal wounds deeper than bullets could make. He'd wake with her name on his lips and the phantom scent of wild flowers in the air, and he'd know that leaving her had been the biggest mistake of his life. It was in a saloon in a dead-end town called P-Dishon that he heard the news. A drunk cowboy was regaling the bar with tales from up north. Stories of towns burned and people scattered by a religious fanatic who claimed to be doing God's work. "Preacher named Morai Cross," the cowboy slurred. "Crazy as a rabid dog and twice as mean. Says he's on a crusade to cleanse the territory of witches and devil worshippers. Burned out 3 towns so far, killed anyone who stood in his way. Colt's blood turned to ice water. What towns? Hell, I don't know. Some place called Haven's Rest was the latest, I think. Heard tell he was looking for some witchwoman who'd escaped his righteous justice. Found her too." The whiskey glass shattered in Colt's hand, cutting his palm, but he barely felt it. "What happened to the woman?" "Same thing that happens to all witches, I reckon. Fire's a powerful cleanser, or so the good preacher says." Colt was out of the saloon and on his horse before the cowboy finished talking, riding north through the night like all the demons of hell were behind him instead of ahead. He pushed his horse to the breaking point and beyond, changing mounts at every way station, sleeping in the saddle when exhaustion threatened to topple him. But he was too late. He was always too late. Haven's Rest was a blackened scar on the landscape, its white-painted houses reduced to charcoal and ash, its gardens trampled into mud. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, and carrion birds wheeled overhead in lazy circles. Colt found Mrs. Henderson's boarding house by the remnants of its front porch, the same porch where he and Ember had shared their last conversation. The building was gutted, its roof collapsed, its windows blown out by the heat of the flames. He searched through the ruins with desperate efficiency, looking for any sign of survivors, any clue to Ember's fate. What he found instead was a message painted on the remains of the church wall in what looked like blood. "The witch is cleansed. The righteous work continues." Colt stared at those words until they burned themselves into his memory. Then slowly, deliberately, he drew his gun and put 6 bullets through the message, obliterating it 1 letter at a time. When his guns were empty, he reloaded and did it again. He spent 2 days searching the surrounding country, following every trail, checking every hiding place he could think of. On the morning of the third day, he found the camp. It was hidden in a box canyon about 10 miles from the ruins of Haven's Rest, a collection of canvas tents and supply wagons arranged around a central fire pit. At the head of the camp, like some twisted parody of altar, stood a wooden platform with another stake driven into its center. And tied to that stake, her white dress, now gray with smoke and blood, was Ember. She was still alive. He could see her chest rising and falling, but she was unconscious, her head lolling forward, her beautiful auburn hair matted and tangled. There were burns on her arms where they'd tested her with flames, and her face was swollen from beatings. Colt counted the men in camp, 12, maybe 15, all armed, all believers in Morai Cross's twisted vision of righteousness. Under normal circumstances, those weren't bad odds for a man with his reputation. But these weren't normal circumstances. This was personal. He waited until noon when the heat made men lazy and the sun was high enough to blind anyone looking in his direction. Then he walked into their camp like death in a black duster. His guns drawn and his heart full of cold, killing fury. The first shot took the sentry in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him in the dust. The second and third shots scattered the men diving for cover around the fire pit, and the fourth put a hole through the water barrel, adding chaos to the mix. Morai Cross. Colt's voice carried across the camp like a judgment from on high. Show yourself, you yellow-bellied dog. A man emerged from the largest tent, tall and lean, with wild gray hair and eyes that burned with fanatic fire. He wore a preacher's black suit, but there was nothing holy about the gun in his hand or the madness in his face. You dare interfere with God's work, Cross screamed, spittle flying from his lips. I dare a lot of things. Colt walked forward, his boots crunching on the gravelly ground, his guns never wavering. Killing murdering scum is just one of them. Cross raised his gun and Colt shot him through the wrist, sending the weapon spinning away into the dust. The preacher fell to his knees, clutching his shattered hand, his face twisted with pain and outrage. She's a witch, he screamed. A servant of darkness. God commands her death. God didn't command anything, Colt said, pressing the hot barrel of his gun against Cross's forehead. That was just you using religion to justify murder. The remaining men had scattered, some running for their horses, others finding cover behind wagons and supply crates. Colt ignored them all. His attention focused on the mad man kneeling in the dust. You burned down a whole town, he said. Killed innocent people. For what? Because one woman knew how to heal the sick. She consorted with demons. Cross spat. Her power came from hell itself. Her power came from knowledge and compassion, two things you wouldn't recognize if they bit you on the ass. Colt pulled back the hammer of his gun, the sound sharp and final in the desert air. Cross's eyes widened with the first real fear he'd shown. Wait, he gasped. I'm a man of God. You can't kill a servant of the Lord. I'm not killing a servant of the Lord, Colt said quietly. I'm putting down a rabid dog. The shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Cross toppled backward. His twisted crusade ended. His madness finally silenced. The remaining men offered no resistance as Colt cut Ember free from the stake. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin hot with fever. He carried her to the shade of a rock overhang and used water from his canteen to clean her wounds and cool her burning forehead. Come on, darling, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Don't you dare leave me now. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly fixing on his face. For a moment she just stared at him like she couldn't believe he was real. Cold, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm here, I've got you, I knew you'd come. Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dust and grime. I knew you wouldn't leave me to burn. Never again, he promised, crushing her against his chest. I'll never leave you again. 2 years later, in a valley far from the burned ruins of Haven's Rest, a small cabin sat beside a clear stream, its garden bright with medicinal herbs and healing plants. Smoke rose from the chimney in the early morning air, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the nearby schoolhouse. Colt Steele hung up his guns for the last time on the day he married Ember Wilde, trading his reputation as the fastest draw in the territory for something infinitely more valuable, a chance at redemption, a place to belong, and a love worth more than all the gold in California. The people of their new town knew them as the schoolmaster and the healer, the couple who'd come from somewhere else, carrying their own shadows, but determined to build something better. They didn't ask about the past, or the faded scars on Ember's wrists, or the way Colt's hands sometimes moved to his empty holster when strangers rode into town. Some stories were better left untold. But on quiet evenings when the work was done and the world was peaceful, Colt would sit on their front porch with Ember in his arms, watching the sun set over their valley. And he'd remember the day he'd ridden through fire to save her life. It was the day he'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing a man could do wasn't drawing his gun. It was putting it away and choosing love over violence, hope over fear, and healing over hurt. The wind still called to him sometimes, whispering of far places and distant trails. But Ember was right. Even the wind needed a place to rest.